Piers Morgan thought he could silence Jonathan Roumie with interruptions and intimidation tactics. He cut him off 6 times in a row, his voice rising with every attempt to shut him down. The live studio fell silent, tension thick in the air like electricity before a storm. But what Jonathan said on his 7th attempt didn't just silence Morgan, it shattered his argument and left the veteran broadcaster speechless for the first time in his career. The moment that followed would break the internet, rack up millions of views across social media, and prove that the most powerful answer to bullying isn't to fight with louder aggression. It's to use precision, truth, and perfect timing to land a knockout blow no one sees coming. Before we dive into this unforgettable showdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss these epic moments. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The studio was packed that Tuesday night, cameras rolling as the network prepared for what many assumed would be a routine debate segment. But nothing about this night would be routine. At center stage sat Piers Morgan, the British television host known worldwide for his sharp tongue, trademark smirk, and relentless style in political battles. His suit was perfectly pressed, his confidence unmistakable. For years, he had thrived on confrontation, cutting off politicians, athletes, and celebrities alike, winning ratings by dominating every guest who dared to challenge him. The audience buzzed with anticipation. Reporters filled the press area, laptops open, ready to transcribe a headline-worthy clash. Spectators lined the edges, some skeptical, others openly supportive of Morgan's reputation as an unbeatable interviewer. The stage lights glared hot, but it was the tension, not the heat, that made the room feel heavy. Behind the cameras, Morgan's production team hovered like generals before battle. They had briefed him for every possible angle, armed with statistics, one-liners, and rhetorical traps. This was their star host, the man who could dismantle any guest and turn criticism back on the critic. He had done it countless times before. Across from him, Jonathan Roumie adjusted his microphone and glanced over his notes one last time. The actor, best known for his role as Jesus in The Chosen, had prepared extensively for this appearance. He knew Morgan's reputation for aggression and verbal warfare. He had studied hours of footage, learned his patterns, and anticipated every attempt to derail the conversation. His preparation wasn't about political talking points. It came from years of portraying moral conviction on screen and from living a life grounded in faith and empathy. Roumie wasn't there to win applause with flashy comebacks. He was there to embody calm under fire and to speak for those whose voices were too often drowned out. But what he wasn't prepared for was just how relentlessly Morgan would try to silence him. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two men are and why this battle mattered so much. Piers Morgan had built his career on being the man who never backed down. At 59, he was one of the most recognizable broadcasters in the world, known for his no-nonsense hardline style and his ability to dominate any stage he walked onto. His supporters praised him as fearless. His critics accused him of arrogance and cruelty. But everyone agreed on one thing. Piers Morgan knew how to control a conversation, and he rarely lost a sparring match. His formula was simple: interrupt, redirect, overwhelm, speak faster, louder, and with so much certainty that his opponents looked weak or unprepared. In the age of viral clips and short attention spans, his strategy wasn't about truth, it was about dominance. Jonathan Roumie, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. At 50, he had become a global face of spiritual storytelling, admired for the quiet dignity and compassion he brought to his work. Roumie wasn't a politician, he wasn't a lawyer, he didn't come armed with aggressive rhetoric. Instead, he carried something different into that studio: patience, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to speak from the heart. This wasn't just a clash between two public figures, it was a collision of worldviews. Morgan represented an old guard of confrontation, control through volume, interruption, and intimidation. Roumie represented something new: strength without shouting, conviction without cruelty, and the belief that sometimes the quietest voice in the room can be the most powerful. The camera zoomed in, the moderator gave the cue, and both men leaned toward their microphones. Morgan smirked, ready to unleash the tactics that had made him famous. Roumie took a steady breath, ready to show the world what happens when preparation meets grace, and when someone finally refuses to be silenced. Jonathan Roumie took a deep breath, looked directly at Piers Morgan, and prepared to show the country what happens when patience meets conviction, when someone finally refuses to be silenced. The moderator opened the segment, giving Jonathan the floor for his response. He began with what seemed like a straightforward question about compassion and accountability in policy decisions. But Morgan immediately sensed where he was heading and cut him off before he could build any momentum. "Jonathan," Morgan interrupted sharply, his voice slicing through the air, "you're fundamentally misunderstanding the entire issue here. What you're calling cruelty is simply the reality of law enforcement. If you'd actually read the full reports, you'd know better. It was a classic Piers move, swift, calculated, designed to throw his guest off balance from the very first question. Years of media training had taught him that the first few seconds of any hostile exchange were crucial. Establish dominance early, control the narrative, and never let your opponent finish a thought." Roumie paused, his hands folded calmly on the desk. The interruption was exactly what he had expected. His voice remained steady. "Piers, I appreciate your perspective, but I'd like to finish my point first." He tried again. "As I was saying, regarding the responsibility leaders hold when lives are at stake." No, Morgan cut in, waving his hand dismissively. "You can't just throw around dramatic words like responsibility or suffering without context. The media twists everything, and frankly, questions like yours are exactly why people have lost trust in these conversations." A ripple went through the audience. Some chuckled approvingly at Morgan's bravado, while others shifted uncomfortably. Jonathan, however, remained perfectly composed, jotting down a note on the card in front of him. "Piers," he said softly, "I understand you have strong feelings on this, but I have a limited time to speak, and I'd appreciate the chance to finish." He tried a third time. "According to your own interviews and public statements, you dismissed concerns raised by parents whose children—" "Oh, here we go with cherry-picked anecdotes," Morgan interjected, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Jonathan, if you're going to rely on out-of-context sob stories, then this isn't a serious debate. This is theater. Maybe good for your Hollywood career, but not for reality." The smirk on his face waned as he leaned back in his chair, spreading his arms in classic dominance posture. His body language said it all. "I'm in control here." But Roumie didn't flinch. His jaw tightened just slightly, but his voice remained calm. The cameras caught the contrast perfectly. Morgan smug and dismissive, Roumie patient and unshaken. "Piers," Jonathan said evenly, "I notice you haven't actually addressed any of the concerns I raised. Are you unable to, or are you simply choosing not to?" Morgan's eyes flashed with irritation. "I'm choosing not to indulge in emotional gotcha questions designed to go viral on Twitter. If you want to have a serious conversation about policy, I'm here. If you want to play saint for your fan base, find someone else." Jonathan shuffled his papers slowly, then looked up with an expression Morgan didn't recognize, a quiet confidence that should have warned him to be careful. "Let me try a different approach," Roumie said, his tone controlled. "You've spent decades in broadcasting, presenting yourself as a truth teller. So let me ask you this." Morgan scoffed with a dismissive laugh. "Oh, please, don't pretend this is about truth. This is about you trying to get a soundbite that makes you look noble on YouTube. I've seen this playbook 100 times. Actors, rookies, newcomers, they all come in thinking they can score points by taking me on. You've been in the spotlight, what, a few years? And you think you understand the world better than someone who's been doing this for decades? This," he gestured broadly to the studio, "is exactly what's wrong with our culture. Inexperienced voices preaching instead of listening." The studio grew eerily quiet. Even Morgan's supporters in the audience shifted uncomfortably at the personal jab. Jonathan set down his pen and looked him in the eye. For the first time since the segment began, he smiled. Not a friendly smile, but one filled with conviction. "Piers," he said softly, "thank you for that assessment. Now I have a question for you." Morgan leaned forward, ready to interrupt again, but something in Roumie's tone made him pause. The room held its breath. Jonathan's voice was calm, measured, but devastatingly precise. "If you are such a champion of truth and accountability, can you explain why, despite all your years demanding answers from others, you've consistently dismissed the suffering of children and families as mere theater? Because according to the very reports you cite on your show, thousands of children were torn from their parents without any system in place to reunite them. And when asked about it, your response was, 'That's not my problem.'" The question landed like a bomb in the studio. Piers Morgan's smirk vanished. His face paled. For the first time in the broadcast, he had no quip, no interruption, no sarcastic comeback. "That's for someone else to figure out," Piers Morgan muttered defensively. his earlier bravado suddenly slipping. The studio went completely silent. You could hear the hum of the stage lights. The audience leaned forward, sensing a shift. Jonathan Roumie's voice came low, steady, almost surgical. "So here's my question, Piers, and I'd appreciate if you could answer it without interrupting me this time. How does a man who claims to be a champion of truth dismiss the suffering of children as a mere theater? Because that doesn't sound like truth to me. That sounds like either incompetence or cruelty, and I'm trying to figure out which one it is." Morgan froze, his mouth slightly open. For the first time in his long career of televised combat, he had no response. The man who built his reputation on never being silenced sat there, completely speechless. The pause stretched for what felt like forever, though it was barely 10 seconds. Then someone in the audience gasped. The camera zoomed in on Morgan's face, his smirk gone, his expression hollow. Roumie wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his tone still calm, but now carrying unmistakable moral weight. "And while you search for an answer, let me remind you of this. During those years, 545 children were never reunited with their parents. 545 children, Piers. Some of them were infants, babies who couldn't even say their own names. You want to talk about experience? You want to talk about expertise? For years, I've spoken to people of faith, families torn apart by systems that didn't value their humanity. And what I see here isn't expertise. It's a man treating human beings like statistics and then getting angry when someone dares to ask him to account for it." Morgan finally found his voice, but it came out as a broken stammer. "Jonathan, that's not... the processes were..." Roumie cut him off, his voice sharpening for the first time. "The processes were what, Piers? Designed to cause maximum pain? Because that's what they accomplished." The audience was riveted. Jonathan's eyes locked on Morgan's. "You interrupted me 6 times in the last 10 minutes because you didn't want people to hear these questions. You mocked my experience, my role, even my motives, because you thought you could bully me into silence." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But here's what you didn't count on. I've spent years facing people who thought they could intimidate me, people who believed they could steamroll over truth with volume and arrogance. And I've learned something. Silence can be stronger than shouting, and conviction can be stronger than cruelty." Morgan's hands gripped the desk. His face turned bright red, the confidence draining away on live television. The transformation was so dramatic that the cameras instinctively zoomed in to capture every detail of his unraveling. "So no," Roumie continued firmly, "your interruptions don't impress me. Your sarcasm doesn't intimidate me, and your attempts to dodge responsibility don't surprise me. What surprises me is that you thought they'd still work." The line landed like a sword cutting through the set. The audience broke into applause. Morgan, the man who prided himself on always controlling the conversation, had lost it in front of millions. Roumie sat back, his voice returning to its calm, centered tone. The contrast between his composure and Morgan's obvious agitation was stark, and the cameras captured every second. "Now," Jonathan said, his gaze unwavering, "would you like to answer my original question about accountability? Or would you prefer to explain to the public why you think children's suffering doesn't deserve an answer?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. The audience held their breath. Reporters in the front row scrambled to type every word. Morgan looked around as if searching for an escape, but there was none. The processes followed all applicable statutes," he finally stammered. "That's not what I asked," Roumie replied simply. "I asked if you had a system to protect the children. Did you or didn't you?" Another long pause. Morgan's eyes darted toward the crew for help that wasn't coming. "The system was handled by multiple organizations." "So that's a no," Roumie said, leaning back. "You oversaw suffering, you dismissed it, and you never fixed it. Thank you for that clarification." Even before the broadcast ended, clips of the exchange were going viral. Someone in the live audience had streamed it straight to social media, and within minutes the hashtag #PiersSilenced was trending worldwide. The moment when Morgan's voice cracked was replayed thousands of times per minute, but the clip that truly exploded was Roumie's line. "I've faced people who thought they could intimidate me into silence, and I've learned something. Silence can be stronger than shouting. Conviction can be stronger than cruelty." It became an instant meme shared by people everywhere who had endured bullies in their own lives. Executives in boardrooms, students facing aggressive professors, activists standing up to critics. Everyone saw themselves in Roumie's calm defiance. Morgan's attempts to recover only made things worse. Each stammer, each red-faced reaction, was clipped and edited into montages of what happens when someone finally stands up to a bully on live television. By the time the network cut to commercial, the damage was irreversible. What had begun as just another debate segment had transformed into a cultural moment, a case study in what happens when arrogance collides with conviction and loses. "This is what it looks like when preparation meets grace," wrote one viewer, sharing the clip with thousands of their followers. But the most shared clip wasn't even Jonathan Roumie's devastating question about accountability. It was a single, quiet line. "I've faced people who thought they could intimidate me into silence, and I've learned that silence can be stronger than shouting, and conviction can be stronger than cruelty." That 15-second soundbite spread like wildfire. Women in corporate boardrooms shared it, students battling dismissive professors replayed it, and activists who had stood toe-to-toe with hostile opponents called it a rallying cry. Commentators were already calling it one of the most powerful live broadcast moments in years. Not because of any shocking new facts, but because of what it revealed: the shifting balance of power in public discourse. For decades, Piers Morgan had built his career on being the man who couldn't be silenced. He was the guy networks called when they wanted someone who could dominate a guest, overwhelm a critic, or turn any conversation into a victory lap for himself. His ability to control dialogue through volume, interruptions, and sheer force of personality had made him a legend to his supporters and a dreaded opponent to many. His Morgan method was studied in media circles: interrupt, dismiss, overpower, make the other person look weak. Training programs for aspiring pundits had even used his clips as examples of how to win the optics of an argument, even if you never addressed the substance. But Jonathan Roumie had just exposed the fatal flaw in that approach. It only works when your opponent doesn't know how to handle it. Piers's tactics worked for years because most guests weren't trained to deal with relentless interruption, explained one media analyst. But Roumie's background in storytelling and faith gave him something different. He knew how to let Morgan hang himself. Conservative commentators rushed to defend Morgan, arguing that Roumie had been unfair or that he'd used gotcha moments. But those defenses only highlighted how completely the tables had turned. The man who had mocked others for playing to the cameras was now being defended with the same excuse. And this confrontation wasn't just about one television segment. It touched something deeper: the changing nature of authority in modern society. Morgan represented the old guard, the style of dominance where whoever shouted loudest won. Roumie represented something else entirely: strategic patience, quiet strength, and the kind of moral clarity that doesn't need to raise its voice to cut through the noise. As one columnist wrote, this wasn't about policy. This was about what happens when a man who built his career on shouting finally meets someone who cannot be shouted down. The generational contrast wasn't lost on observers either. Morgan, though not elderly, embodied an older model of confrontation. Roumie, just a few years younger, came from a world shaped by different kinds of battles. Not political theater, but personal conviction, storytelling, and the power of empathy to transform hearts. Morgan's team scrambled into damage control mode. Their first instinct was to attack Roumie personally, questioning his qualifications and mocking his background as just an actor. Within hours, Morgan's producers were on sister networks insisting Piers was trying to have a serious policy conversation, but Roumie was more interested in creating viral moments. That strategy collapsed almost instantly. Social media users began splicing together side-by-side clips. Morgan's team preaching about professionalism on one screen and Morgan himself on the other, cutting Roumie off 6 times in a row. The optics were brutal. Their second attempt was to pivot back to substance, releasing detailed talking points about statistics and trends. But by then, no one was listening. The story wasn't about data anymore. It was about dignity. Morgan himself went unusually quiet, avoiding direct comment for nearly 2 days, a rarity for someone who normally thrived on instant rebuttals. When he finally issued a statement, it was carefully worded, defending his general approach while carefully avoiding any mention of the viral confrontation. But it was too late. The broadcast had sent shockwaves through the media world. Commentators who once tiptoed around aggressive hosts now had a template for how to withstand them. Roumie showed us that you don't fight bullies by being louder, one strategist said. You fight them by being calmer, smarter, and better prepared. Even rival producers reportedly began rethinking how they staged debates, cautioning their hosts to avoid overusing the aggressive posturing that had once seemed like guaranteed ratings gold. And while analysts debated the political and cultural implications, something more human emerged from the viral moment. Roumie's words weren't abstract arguments. They were about real people, real families, real children whose pain had too often been brushed aside as theatrics. One advocacy group wrote simply, "Jonathan did on live TV what we've been trying to do for years. He forced someone in power to confront the human cost without being able to hide behind noise." "Jonathan Roumie did what many of us have been trying to do for years," said one advocate. "He forced someone in power to confront the human cost of their words without being able to hide behind bluster or talking points." Families affected by years of dismissive rhetoric began sharing their own stories online, using the viral moment as a chance to put human faces on the statistics Morgan had once treated as abstractions. Political observers soon began referring to the confrontation as the Roumie template, a new model for how to handle aggressive interviewers and hostile debates. The template had three clear elements: thorough preparation, not with statistics, but with unshakable moral clarity; strategic patience, letting the opponent overextend themselves; calm conviction, turning interruption tactics into proof of bad faith. Morgan's biggest mistake was thinking that cutting off Jonathan 6 times would make him look strong. Instead, it made him look desperate and afraid of what Roumie might say. Media trainers began incorporating the exchange into workshops for politicians, executives, and advocates. "This is required viewing for anyone who might face a hostile interviewer," one coach explained. As the immediate aftermath settled into long-term analysis, big questions emerged. Would other aggressive hosts modify their tactics after seeing how spectacularly Morgan's approach had backfired? Would public figures think twice before interrupting their guests on live television? Or was this a once-in-a-generation moment, lightning in a bottle, born from Roumie's unique blend of preparation, patience, and faith? But perhaps the most important impact wasn't in the studios or the headlines. It was in the millions of viewers watching at home. For them, seeing Roumie refuse to be silenced wasn't just entertainment. It was a demonstration that someone like them could stand up to figures who once seemed untouchable. 6 months later, the clip was still being shown in leadership seminars and communication courses. Business schools used it in classes on negotiation and conflict resolution. Media academies added it to their curricula on interview dynamics. Leadership trainers held it up as a study in the difference between aggression and true strength. It had become a cultural touchstone for discussions about power, faith, and dignity in public life. Roumie's calm dismantling of Morgan's tactics resonated with anyone who had ever been talked over, dismissed, or intimidated. "He showed us that you don't have to match someone's energy to defeat them," wrote one commentator. "Sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is absolute calm, backed by absolute conviction." In the end, the confrontation between Jonathan Roumie and Piers Morgan became more than a viral TV clip. It became a masterclass in how to handle bullies, a demonstration that preparation and patience can outlast arrogance and noise, and proof that sometimes the quietest voice in the room can be the most powerful. That was the showdown everyone was talking about, and it was the perfect example of what happens when preparation meets opportunity, and when someone finally refuses to be silenced. And if you enjoyed this breakdown of one of the most dramatic live TV confrontations in recent memory, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss moments like these. What did you think of Roumie's strategy? Let us know in the comments, and share this video with anyone who needs to see what happens when bullying tactics finally meet their match. We'll see you in the next video, where we'll break down the latest drama that has the world buzzing.